Hello, and welcome back to the Mindful Education Summit. I'm Lisa Fluck, one of your hosts. In this session, we're talking with Oscar Medina, who is project manager and facilitator at Mind Body Awareness Project. He brings mindfulness, movement, and life skills to at-risk kids and teens. So we'll be diving into his work and what he sees as possibilities for growth in the mindfulness movement. Oscar, thank you for being here today, and thank you all for tuning in. Can you tell us about the work you do with the Mind Body Awareness Project?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And the work that I do, I facilitate groups, both with at-risk youth and also with adults. And I project manage, a grant that we're working on right now that's specifically related to work that we're doing with adults in Alameda County. Yeah.
How did you get involved in this work?
So, like many of us who got involved in this work, I got involved in this work as a result of my own trauma. I grew up in East LA and, had I was an at-risk youth, I was, going down that path. And it took me a long time before I was able to realize that I was not on the path that I wanted to be. Went through my own struggles with addiction, and that kind of reached an inflection point about 12 years ago. And I found the path of mindfulness and meditation, and I mean, it's been kind of history ever since. And as a result of that, I now have doing this work to kind of give back.
What populations are you primarily serving? Like, how are you bringing the mindfulness and practices there? Is it through schools, after schools, or in what settings?
Yeah, so through Mind Body Awareness Project. So just to give a little bit of context, I've been doing this work of working with, youth since 2014, which was an initiation into the work through the Dalai Lama Fellows, which is the Mindfulness Garden Collective. So created a garden, and I wanted to basically create a garden that had the mindfulness and wellness kind of built in, because there was a lot of community gardens already in the East Bay. For a lot of people don't know where that is. That's in East Bay, California, Bay Area. And so I've been doing that work since then. And I was working both at Mindful Life Project and Mind Body Awareness Project. And I've been working with youth in various capacities, bringing mindfulness, emotional awareness. And I think there was another part to the question there, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of
yeah, that's all good.
Yeah.
And the kind of settings that you work in, you said there were a couple of different programs you worked with, and what kind of settings?
Yeah, that's right. So those settings that I was working with was in schools, and no after school work. So it was all done in schools and then with incarcerated youth, so in juvenile detention centers. Those have been the two primary places that I've worked with youth. And then of course, doing retreats, youth retreats and things like this as well.
It'd be great to hear more about your story and your journey. And so you discovered mindfulness 12 years ago, you said, and then 5 years ago, you started offering trainings to others. And I know somewhere in there, you also co-founded the Mindful Garden Collective. Could you kind of take us on a little journey through that and how that shaped your current work?
Yeah. So, I had been aware of meditation for, I don't know, as far back as I can remember, maybe 12 or 13 years old. I was introduced to a lot of the writings of like mystical Christian actual teachers. And so I was very much interested in mysticism, or, one of the ways in which, meditation comes in is through these kind of contemplative lineages. So I'd certainly been aware of meditation for a long time. And it wasn't until, and I was interested for many, many years, but I wasn't until my late 20s, after going through my own struggles with addiction and, various other traumas, that I was starting to kind of kick up, which starts to happen, right, as these things aren't kept up. They're not actually worked with. And that's when I started to actually work with the practice. I live here in Berkeley, California. There's actually a Buddhist monastery, which is down the street from my house. So this was like the way in to those practices. And, I read a lot of books. I did a lot of teachings, I started to learn a lot of the teachings and kind of bring them into my life and experience some pretty profound shifts. pretty quickly on. And as a result of that, I decided that I wanted to be on a path of service, and I didn't know what that looked like. So I just knew that I wanted to bring meditation into the system, quote unquote, the system, meaning whether that would be through education system, whether it be the prison system. And from there, I met someone who was wanting to create a community garden, and this was a friend of mine who I connected with, and later we decided to apply for this grant through the Dalai Lama Fellows, which was an organization that is, the amazing leadership, mindfulness, essentially a mindfulness leadership organization that prepares young people to do service work. It almost like if you were to put Dalai Lama like into systems, like that was kind of the idea. And so I helped co-found Mindful Garden Collective, which was this amazing, really transformative experience of both getting a tremendous amount of teaching and mentoring and coaching from people on staff, and also learning how to build a project that brought in mindfulness and emotional awareness to the community. Yeah.
And since then, how would you say that shaped your current work?
Yeah, so it shaped it in some pretty significant ways. One was, I think, one of the pieces that I've already mentioned, right, which is this: how do we bring mindfulness, social and emotional awareness, contemplative practice into systems? So that was one way that I was like, oh wow, this is what I felt, that immediate, that immediate resonance, you could say, with like that intersection. So that was one way. And so, I think it was maybe 6 months or 8 months into that journey at the garden that I was like, well, because I was working pro bono. I was like, well, I want to do this as a life path. And Mind Body Awareness Project had an opening for a junior facilitator. So that's where I started. So it shaped my work in that I kind of opened the door for me to start doing that work. And then from there, more opportunities kind of arose. But I think that, yeah, there's a lot more I could say about how specifically that year with the Dalai Lama Fellows really shaped me. But that was one of I think the main ways that really kind of opened me up to this, that there is this capacity to bring mindfulness. And I think now, obviously, we see this throughout the whole mindfulness world, right? It's showing up in business and in education and in psychology and all the other various systems that we're in. Yeah.
So really, it's become a life path.
Yeah.
And what have been some of the challenges and successes in your work?
Yeah. So I would say probably I'm trying to think of, there's many challenges. I think one of the challenges, is that, personally for me, a large part of the reason why I went into this work was because I really admired the embodiment of what the practice really brings. And so not to sound a little critical, but sure, it's gonna, I think one of the things that is challenging for me is that I think that with mindfulness, which I think is great, and we should spread it far and wide, is kind of similar to what happened with yoga in the 90s, right? It's like there was a minting of all these yoga teachers who didn't necessarily embody the practice. And so that's a big part of my own path. And I think that's one of the challenges that I personally have struggled with, is like, where is my embodiment, and am I ready enough to be a teacher? So that was kind of an early struggle. I don't experience that any longer, but it's something that I think about, is our embodiment. And now that I've spent the last kind of 4 years really studying more neuropsychology, and some more therapeutic work that I've been doing with the Hakomi Institute, which is an amazing mindfulness-based somatic psychology organization, which I highly recommend to anybody who listens to this interview, that they check out their work. It's really, really been deep work, is just how much we are transmitting through our nervous system. And especially since we're talking about this in light of teachers, right? This is a mindfulness education summit. And, a lot of teachers, one of the other big challenges that I've seen is, to be fair to teachers, because I know that they're very burned out and they have a lot on their plate. So, but there's also this I think one of the pitfalls that I see is that there's a way in which we look at mindfulness as a fix it to the student, right? It's a corrective behavioral intervention. And I think that that's a really pernicious and not the best way to look at what mindfulness is really about, and certainly what it's about in terms of how do we bring it to the kids. So, I very quickly, I think probably maybe in the second year of my work, very quickly, both the administrative staff and also, leadership within the organizations that I was working with very quickly were like, oh, the quote unquote bad kids, like we're going to put him with Oscar, because he was one of those kids. I was one of those youth. And so I know how to connect with those youth. I know how to talk with them. They feel comfortable with me. There's a trust and safety. But then I think that part was great. But what I started to see also was that there was a way in which the framing of the practice as a way to fix those youth. And so, anyways, there's more I can say on that, but I think I kind of covered what that really, one of those challenges. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so there are real challenges in bringing these kinds of practices into work with youth. How is someone trained? Like, how are you trained, and what kind of training do facilitators for the Mind Body Awareness Project get to be able to work in a skillful way?
Yeah. Well, I think for us, the most important training, and the training that I received, was really hands-on with the actual work and the embodiment of the facilitator. So both doing your own inner work, which I think I would say is, the first training, right? You got to have a practice, and you got to be showing up to your practice. So that's the first thing. You're doing your own work. So that's, I would say, foundational. You can't really do this work. And anyways, that's I could say a lot more about that, but I think that's one. And then there's the other part, which is the facilitation piece. And that's, in my experience, the best way that I learned was by watching some people who were incredibly, incredibly amazing. The person that I worked with Micah Anderson, I didn't even facilitate a group until, which is pretty unusual. And a lot of people might not know this from nonprofits. Maybe they have the sense that as soon as especially if you've never facilitated a meditation or group, that you would just kind of come in and very quickly, maybe 2 weeks of actual training, and then you're off to the races. And many nonprofits work that way. I was fortunate that I wasn't even facilitating a group until 6 months of training. So that means I was going in, I was watching, I was observing, I was taking notes, I was asking a lot of questions. I could speak a little bit, but I wasn't really facilitating groups. So I was essentially shadowing for 6 months before I was actually able to lead. And that I later found out that that's actually really unusual for this kind of work. And certainly with a lot of teachers who will do like a year-long training program and then just start facilitating. And I think, partly it's not like I'm saying that there's this universal or standard for what this is, but I think we all have to kind of check in with ourselves about when are we actually ready to facilitate it. Because in my experience, it looks really easy from the outside. It's like, oh, do some basic breathing and, count to 3 and blah, 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 and do the technique. But the embodiment piece is, and what I keep coming back to, is actually it's not really matched up. So, yeah.
I think what you're saying is really important. So how do you gauge your readiness to teach?
I would say that well, one, I would say first, if you have enough foundation, that means you've done enough of your own work. You've sat on retreat. You have a sense of your own readiness, right? And at least you have a sense of your ability to manage your own triggers in a very, very clear kind of way. That's, I think, just the first step. And then there's of course, can you manage triggers that come up when you're dealing with youth, which is a whole nother level and layer. So that's one of the other pieces. And I don't think that there's a very clear answer to your question. I think for each person it's an individual path, and they will have a sense of knowing. I think that there are clear indicators internally. There's a clear somatic indicator. The body has a sense of what I would call, there's a sense of freedom from tension around the question, first of all. And not to say that we can't have a little bit of anxiety, but there's a sense of, I guess, in therapy, they use the term, you're sitting in your seat, right? So I would say whatever the version of that is for a teacher, there's a sense of you're sitting in yourself, maybe, right? And when there's a feeling of a felt sense of that, there's a way in which you can transmit that sense of ease and confidence and relaxation to the youth that you're working with. And also, I would say, which is even more important, maybe, is authenticity, right? And especially when working with at-risk youth, given that they have a very long history of trauma, and with that comes all of the symptoms of trauma, hypervigilance. Authenticity is just as important as presence. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how would you say that the mindfulness and yoga practices are helping to develop healthy life skills for the kids that you work with? Can you share your experience about what kinds of impacts you've seen?
Yeah. So I'm thinking one example, one of the kids that we have on the unit who's been, in and out of juvie for, pretty much his whole life. And in the last 6 months, I won't share his name for obvious reasons. He has, there was a big riot on the unit. This was, I think, maybe a couple months ago. And he was sharing in the group how, his fists were clenching and he could just feel, I mean, it was like his gang that was literally essentially getting jumped, and he was ready to jump in and into this riot and do what he's done his whole life. But he also had been doing our work and, had gone through our curriculum. And he said that in that moment, he realized that he didn't actually have to go in and jump and get into this fight and then, get X amount more years, that he's already looking at a very long rap sheet. And for him, it was huge for an at-risk youth to not jump into that fight, jump into this whole rival situation that, it's kind of like really baked into his being, right? I think that that's like one example that comes to mind. And now the same youth is meditating 2 hours a day. He's like meditating an hour in the morning, an hour at night. And so, it's amazing. Someone that has that level of trauma, that history, be able to turn it around. And, we have him now actually leading meditations in the group, facilitating check-ins. So, we're starting to give him some more leadership. So that's kind of one amazing kind of example that's been really powerful.
How long had he been working with that MBA project?
So he's been probably done the curriculum a few times. So I would say maybe 6 months, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting the way you described him noticing his bodily sensations.
Right. It was like in that moment, it was like it all clicked.
Yeah.
I mean, he even talked about that. He's like, it was like all of the teachings, everything you guys have been teaching me, man, like it all in that moment. And like I could remember, because we talk about it as we're talking about, we have a module on body intelligence and emotional awareness. And so we always talk about the fists and the clenching and the jaw and so we're, it takes a while with youth. It's like they'll hear it once, but that repetition eventually, it was like he really like heard it in the moment. So yeah, it was powerful for us. Yeah. And it's what energizes us, right? It keeps us coming back to this work, and that the work really does really have a powerful impact.
Yeah, it speaks to the cultivating of awareness. That
Yes,
self-awareness.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What role do you see for families in the work that you do? I mean, knowing that many of these kids are incarcerated and separated from their families.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that the youth are talking about the work with their families, and that I would say that, that's the first thing. In an ideal situation, and I think this might go into another separate question of mindfulness and the kind of possibilities for mindfulness, is that I think the family thing is absolutely crucial and essential. And so the families have to be involved, because even if a youth gets, let's say 3 hours of mindfulness in a week or something like that, which is actually kind of a lot more like an hour, especially if you have a nonprofit that's coming in and doing maybe one one teaching piece a week, you still have all the other hours that they're with their families, that they're at school with all these other teachers. So I would say one of the big ones is for that to be kind of designed in to those who are writing curriculums. How do we engage the parents, and how do we engage the rest of the school staff? So it's really about culture is the way that I'm seeing it. It isn't just about the family. It's like, how are we creating a mindful culture around the youth, the concentric circles, right, that the youth are touching in on. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're seeing this. So it is a systems issue that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially in the last few months, that there's been this whole term that I've been hearing about called social mindfulness, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Um, I think it's a result of I can't remember the name of the gentleman who just wrote a book about this, essentially critiquing the modern mindfulness movement for not being politically engaged enough. And I think he has a point. Obviously the work that I'm doing has definitely a political dimension in that, I'm working in jails and prisons and, and working with a diverse population. But I think that it is a big piece. I mean, I think it's actually an essential piece. Yeah. I have a lot of suspicion against the idea that we can all just find our individual liberation in our own kind of ivory towers or cul-de-sacs. We need to do our own personal practice, absolutely. But there's a communal element that I think needs to go into systems, needs to go into how we relate to each other. And I think that there's something actually specific about this time. I mean, unless you are living in a monastery and you have a monastic life, which is for most of us, that's just not the case. I think that this practice is calling us into a different way of engaging with this really contemplative practice. Yeah.
And so how do you bring that element into the work that you are doing with the youth? Like clearly an example you gave, I mean, this adolescent is learning to be more aware of his own experience and to, you could say, inhibit his impulse maybe to jump in and join the fight. I mean, how do you bring this bigger perspective into your work?
Well, one of the ways is it's written right into our curriculum. We talk about social justice. We talk about, at least, as a Latino, I mean, I bring in a little bit of the bilingual element, especially when I'm talking to Latinos. And to essentially, I mean, one of our curriculums is specifically talks about our trauma module specifically. We're talking about intergenerational trauma and how a lot of the reasons why that they are where they are, there is a systemic element to that. So we lean right into it, right into the teaching of the work, so that the youth are aware. Certainly it is a dance, right? Because we also don't want to disempower people and make them feel like they're a victim of the system. And at the same time, we also want them to be aware that there is a systemic dimension to their trauma, to their conditioning, to why they are where they are. And we also know that there's such a thing as called post-traumatic growth, right? And so post-traumatic growth is this capacity to grow that, the studies that they've done on those people who, based on their ability to withstand and you could say transmute their trauma, can actually grow. I mean, that's certainly my story, right? So I think that it's definitely possible. And so we always talk about that. So it's just giving them a larger perspective on their own experience. Yeah. Yeah. And also to name that it's happening. And that's the beautiful things about running groups, that like it's happening right now, that as they're sharing about whatever it is that they have going on in their lives, in the lives of their families, etc., that there's a transformation that's happening in the group dimension, in the group field. So I think that there's also that element, that there's a community that's being built literally right there in a juvenile detention center. They're locked up, you could say, but in another way, they're actually, this space that we're creating for them is a space for them to actually be free, to be more free than they've been. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when you're working with people with backgrounds, traumatic backgrounds, what kinds of considerations are there when you're asking them to drop into their bodies or focus internally?
Yeah. Well, I think, speaking, going back to the whole trauma piece, right? We know now from looking at trauma research that it's not always the best idea for people to close their eyes, for example, because that can um, kick up old trauma. So it's about essentially giving the youth options. They don't have to close their eyes. They can look at a ground, they can look around. That meditation practice doesn't always look like a kind of hyperstatic stillness, that there's movement, right? Um, there's there's also, I think, a cultural piece here too, which I think is really important, and I would love to see more of. And I think, I was grateful to be a part of a conference a few months ago, the Mindfulness, Social Justice, and Youth Conference at the Ford Foundation in New York City, and we talked a lot about diversity, and specifically for me, working, in with incarcerated and at-risk youth, most of them are Black and brown youth. And so mindfulness is much different for them, like in terms of what it actually is. And so I think that there's also that piece. Trauma informed isn't just the Western notion of what trauma is and how it looks, because even that has a certain, you could call it a certain colonialism, right? That is actually happening as well. It's subtle, but it's actually present. So there's also a certain way in which trauma informed for me is culturally informed as well. Like they go hand in hand. And so that means obviously that we actually know how to transmit these practices in a way that speaks to their own cultural knowing. And that isn't always the easiest thing. And it isn't only about being hip and cool and like, quoting the newest rap song, like, because that's how people think when they think culture. And oh, well, how do I? It's actually a much more subtle process. Yeah, that takes some time. You got to know them. You got to kind of know the youth before you can kind of get to that level of what that really means for them.
I hear you
Yeah.
in part talking about in kind of assets based approach and
Yes,
looking at the
exactly.
strengths of the youth and what they know. And can
Exactly.
you can you speak more to the culturally informed ways that you work with youth, like people of color?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the ways, very obviously, is just like right from the very beginning, um, going into the groups. I mean, we have something called the stance on change, which is that we're not there to change them. And especially for a youth who his whole, especially if you're talking about an incarcerated or an at-risk youth, their whole life, what's the one thing that everybody has told them to do? You need to change, right? So that might be when we walk in there, and that's literally how we start our groups is we're actually not here to help you to change. Of course, internally, we, we want the youth to transform their lives, but we understand. I mean, it's kind of like, Lisa, I mean, what was it like when you were a teenager and your parents were like, don't do this, right? Yeah, we're all teenagers. We remember that. It's like we're going to go out and do that. So it's also partly that, just being aware that in that very pivotal age, that very pivotal age of, 13 to 18, that there's an individuation process that's actually happening. And we acknowledge that as well. And actually, one of the modules that I worked on that we've now introduced to youth is a rites of passage module, which I think is really important, which is essentially acknowledging the transition that the youth are going through right now, just at a developmental perspective. So, anyways, that's kind of going farther afield from your question, but yeah.
So when you're working in this kind of system, how do you avoid burnout?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think, give me a second to really feel into that. I think that we get bombarded a lot with this whole idea of self-care, and that's important. So I'll just name that. Let's put that to the side, right? like the traditional forms of self-care. Practice meditation, do yoga, eat right, exercise, get out in nature, drink enough water, all these things, right? We all know them. It doesn't, especially given the amount of information that we imbibe. That's an easy one, I think. But putting that off to the side for a moment, I think for me, there's two pieces. One is really acknowledging our real intention about why we're actually doing this work. Because sometimes we may have certain ideas about who we are and how or what we're supposed to be doing and why we're doing it, and they might not actually be totally in alignment. And so I think there's a more fundamental question there for me around, like, what is our real intention, and why is it that we want to serve the populations we want to serve, and all of that. So I think that that's a deeper question, and I think that that kind of is it's ahead of the burnout stage in a way. And I know it doesn't like necessarily like hit right there what the question you're asking me, but I think it's actually more important, because to me that's the ultimate resource. It's more resourceful than the yoga and the meditation and all that. Is like, who are we really? And why is it that we're really doing this work? It's actually the ultimate nourishment piece. And when there's a clear sense of you are exactly where you need to be, and there's a felt sense of that, and no one can really answer that question for you. You just kind of, there's a felt knowing, at least in my experience. You can deal with the stressors and the other pieces. So yeah, I'd say that for me is really kind of the way that I can avoid burnout. And of course I have burned out and have had that experience. So it's not fun. It's not fun. But for me, I guess what I keep coming back to is that piece, is the intention and the purpose behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
It's a really nice perspective, and comes from a place of wisdom. I can hear through experience. I'm also wondering if you could speak to, so what happens with these youth who you worked with when they're incarcerated? Like, what happens once they're out of jail? What does life look like then in practice?
Yeah. Well, Lisa, you talked about the challenges of this work. This is probably one of the biggest challenges, as that I actually don't know what happens. They're wardens of the court. So there's no way to really, know. I mean, I did have an interest, you get lucky sometimes. A couple of weeks ago, I was on the subway, we call it the BART here in the Bay Area. And I looked over, I was coming, I was walking and I was finding a place to sit. And there was one of my youth. And I sat down next to him, and he had his headphones on. And I looked over at him and I'm all, "What's up, man?" And he was like, "Oh my God, what's up?" And he just like gave me a high five, hugged me, and we ended up riding the BART for 30 minutes. And, we talked about his life, and he was, he's like, "I'm doing great. And, I've got a job now." And, all the things that you want to hear. And, this was one of the most difficult youth that we certainly had coming through our work. And, it was one of those moments where I got to see that, but that doesn't happen very often. I've gotten to see that. I've had that experience maybe 2 or 3 times in doing this work for now going on 5 years now. So it's just the setup of how the system is specifically working with juveniles and the courts and all of that doesn't allow us. So it's not that we certainly don't want to, it's just for legal reasons we actually don't have access to that information. Yeah.
And I think you touched on something that I wanted to revisit, because you said that he was one of the toughest youth that you worked with. And I think sometimes when you work with youth, you don't always know if you're reaching them.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that, because and I mean, he's talking about, we play these Tibetan singing bowls, and he was mentioning all these things. And I remember when you said this, and one of the things that struck me, he's all, "Oscar, I always remember this. like I always remembered this. And I was like he was pointing to his heart. And you know, I thought it was the like really cool way that I explained trauma in the window of tolerance, right? And it's like usually it's not that. And this goes back to the embodiment. It's like they remember, at least they remember our hearts, right? They remember how we made them, you know, that famous, I think it's Maya Angelou, if I'm not mistaken, that famous quote that people won't remember what we said, but how we make them feel. And something must have come through, because he really, you know, to this day, it's part of the way he looks out at the world that he lives in. So yeah, yeah,
That feeling of connection and
yes,
care. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
And so I think to kind of close out, but my last question would be, what do you see as the next frontier in this work? So you're doing this training with incarcerated youth, and where does like law enforcement, the justice system fit into this, or other ways to expand on this whole systems wide effort?
yeah. So, you know, personally, right now I am working with MBA, doing this work with adults, and specifically actually working with law enforcement. So we're actually working on training the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, both the sheriffs, the people who are working in the prison, and the clinical staff. So that's one way. That's the systems level. On a more personal level, I just got a grant through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, through what's called the Culture of Health Leadership. So it's a 3-year grant. And so I plan on bringing this work to the Latino population. That's, you know, going into this work, what I think one of the things that has been missing, there's just not a lot of this kind of work for Latinx populations. So personally, I would say that that is the next frontier for me. I've already been kind of prototyping and testing, and I've already seen a lot of good feedback, and I'm looking for people to build this movement, to really bring this work to Latinx and people of color at large. And so yeah, I just say, you know, if anybody out there really hears this and resonates with me, to reach out, because I would love to. I think this is a big part of the movement that I think is really important right now, is the diversity piece. So yeah, that's definitely one that I'm very passionate about and engaged with. Yeah.
Thank you, Oscar. That's very exciting, and
Yeah.
so appreciate your sharing and talking with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Likewise.